Minister McKay, Senator McCain, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and Foreign Affairs is delighted to be a media partner of the Halifax International Security Forum. This is truly one of the most important gatherings of the year for anybody involved in security issues, and I see not just many past and present authors from our pages, but future ones as well, and certainly everybody is a reader. So we're delighted to be connected with this and hope for a long and fruitful partnership. I have the great pleasure today of moderating our plenary with an extremely distinguished panel to discuss the question of how the world has changed over the last decade since 9/11 and what the current challenges are. You all have their biographies in your materials, but let me just quickly introduce our panelists. Francis Delon, Senator Mark Udall, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and Zafar Abbas. We have extraordinary range of not just national backgrounds, but talent and disciplinary backgrounds to address a really crucial question. A decade and a couple of months ago, had this forum gathered here, we would have been addressing a certain range of issues. And a mere couple of months later, those issues would have been tossed out the window with an entire new set of homeland security, of terrorism, of Middle Eastern turmoil, of political dysfunction in broad swaths of the world, what could and should and had to be done about it, would have taken the stage. Now, a decade later, after two major wars, after an ongoing global war on terror, after a financial crisis, after the rise of the rest, as it's been called, the continued transfer of power from the transatlantic world to the developing world, particularly in Asia and elsewhere, the landscape looks a lot different. There are still challenges, but those challenges may or may not be the same as they were a decade ago, and we've brought together a really impressive panel to discuss that with us. So let me just kick it off quickly by asking our panelists to start it off with a few words on how they think the world has changed over the last decade, and are we still living in the immediate legacy of 9/11 a decade on, or is a new set of challenges really the most relevant set of things to focus on? Mr. Delon.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to start by asking ourselves whether the item of terrorism should be on the top of our agenda, as it has been for many years, and especially since 9/11. We start today, the first topic in our agenda is terrorism. Is it right? This is the first question I would like to ask. What do we see? What have we seen since 9/11? We have seen in 9/11 a terrorist organization able to challenge, in a way, the most powerful country in the world by what happened in New York, by what happened in Washington. We have seen this organization able to settle itself in Afghanistan. What do we see today? We see today that this organization is no longer able, I think, to do such things. We see that this organization has no longer the leader it had in 2011. Osama bin Laden is dead. We see today this organization has been struck many times by us, by our operations indeed in Afghanistan, by the policies that have been carried out by our countries, by our intelligence agencies, and we have been able so far to prevent major actions since 9/11. Indeed, we have seen a lot of terrorist actions. Indeed, we have seen many bombings all over the world, but we have not seen an action on the size of the overreach of what happened in 9/11. So what I think now, I think that Al-Qaeda is no longer the same. Al-Qaeda, in my view, has no longer the capacity to be such a global organization able to plan and to carry out such actions. What we see today is some organizations like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, like Al-Qaeda in the Arabic Peninsula, that are very dangerous, that are also very active. We see indeed a lot of terrorist action carried out in Pakistan, carried out also in Afghanistan. But those terrorist organizations are more linked to a specific conflict, to a specific territory. The whole idea of a global organization with a global agenda is no longer here. This is the main thing of what I see today. What does that mean for us? Does that mean that terrorism is no longer an issue? Yes, it is. Indeed, it is an issue. But the question is whether it is an issue that will be the central issue of our strategy. This is the question that we have to ask ourselves. I don't think that we have to be less aggressive in the action taken out by our intelligence agencies, taken out by our governments. But I see that we need to have a sense of proportion regarding the issue of terrorism and when we take into account other issues. That's what we'd like to see to start.
Thank you very much. Senator Warren.
Speaking from an American perspective, I think everything has changed, and not to be cute, nothing has changed. And when I say everything has changed, the events of 9/11, for those of us who live on the North American continent, they shattered a sense of confidence, a sense that we inhabit an island continent. The literal declaration of war on the United States caught many of our citizens and policymakers off guard, and unbeknownst to us, we had been targeted. The intervening 10 years, however, I would suggest, if you look more broadly, would also suggest nothing has changed. The challenges 10 years ago that the world faced haven't really altered in their structure and in their form. And I would reference Gideon as I summarize, because I'm excited about hearing from the people who are here, looking forward to the conversation. In the late 90s, two senators who Senator McCain served with, who were well-respected, Gary Hart, a Democrat, Senator Warren Rudman, a Republican from New Hampshire, put forth a national security call to action. They identified terrorism as a true threat, one that was emerging, that rogue actors, in some cases rogue states, would commit acts of terrorism to make political statements. They, in effect, anticipated what happened on 9/11. The most important thing they did was lay out a way in which we could counter those forces of dissolution, chaos, and anarchy. And those counters are ones that all of us are grappling with right now. How do you educate your populations so that you can compete in a 21st century economy? How do you have a diplomatic approach that's as much people to people as embassy to embassy? How are your security forces structured so that you have a smart but a tough approach using limited resources? This commission even identified our coming problems with our debt. And I think, in a sense, the existential threats, and I'll end on this note, that we face are climate change, our debt, and technology at times that gets ahead of our capacity to manage our own technologies. So terrorism is an important threat that we face. It is not an existential threat, with one caveat, and that is if a rogue nation or a rogue group put their hands on a nuclear weapon. Then I think there's an element of an existential threat in terrorist activities. It's great to be here. Thank you for convening us.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, you were actually tweeting the previous session, so as a resident expert on technology and new media. What are your thoughts on these questions?
Well, first of all, I'm also delighted to be here, and I am also going to speak from an American perspective. We're the Americans here in the center. I think there are three things that have changed. Two that have to do with our response to the threats. I actually agree with Senator Udall that many of the threats are the same. And then the third that I do think is different, at least as a phenomenon, and can be a threat. So the first big change you just heard from Secretary Panetta. The immediate response of the United States was essentially to embrace unilateralism again. We welcomed the support that we got right after 9/11, but if you remember, we actually tried to discourage NATO from invoking Article 5. It was primacy, it was coalitions of the willing. You just heard Secretary Panetta talk about no nation can stand alone, partnerships, alliances, global security architecture. We can't do this alone. We have to do this together. That was increasingly visible in the second half of the George W. Bush administration, and I will put to you that this administration has been as multilateral as any we've ever seen, and I think that will continue because of the nature of the problems and because of the lessons we learned, certainly in Iraq. The second big change is that we've responded in the way we just heard, militarily, fighting terrorism, state-to-state reactions. But we've also responded fundamentally by elevating development. The biggest lesson, I think, for American foreign policy has been to recognize through the problems of fragile states, but also the problems of climate change, of global pandemics, of resource scarcity, of economic instability, have to be addressed on the ground as much as state to state. So that this forum is now only half of what we would call our national security policy. The other half is bottom-up development, and the task for the next decade is to bring those two communities together. The third big change is exactly that I can sit here and tweet out what Secretary Panetta was saying. I checked to make sure it was on the record before I did that. That goes out to almost 20,000 people all over the world. They, in turn, are sending news from wherever they are. So we are watching what's happening in the Middle East, in Syria right now, from people on the ground, going to bloggers, coming to foreign policy commentators everywhere. The ability of every individual to connect every other individual and to report on what they see is a source of continual disruption, the likes of which we've never seen before. And we are only beginning to get a handle on how we have to prepare to respond. It's not just the specific phenomena of social movements that are enabled or facilitated by social media. It's the ability of individuals to connect with each other in ways that mean you can have constant rolling social and political movements that governments have never encountered before.
Mr. Abbas.
Well, there has been no dispute over the issue that the world has changed in the last 10 years. The debate is on whether the change has been for the better. One can easily say that the United States has done a remarkable job in securing the own country. And fortunately, there has been no major terrorist attack in the last 10 years. But the same cannot be said for many other countries. For instance, the country I come from, in the last, say, 8 or 10 years, there have been 260 suicide bombings, dozens of other bomb attacks, more than 35,000 people have been killed, and people are still counting. One can go on discussing whether it's the fault of the Pakistani security establishment, Pakistani government, because of the American policy, the way attack was carried out. All these issues are there. But countries have become more insecure in the last 10 years. So, yes, I agree in the sense that Al-Qaeda's ability to carry out major strikes has been contained. Osama bin Laden has been killed. Many other senior commanders of Al-Qaeda have been eliminated. What we see mainly in the Islamic societies today is not a threat from Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda being given a base over there. The real threat and the challenge in the next 10 years will be what I see is kind of Al-Qaedaism, the philosophy that is spreading, bringing together smaller militant groups. A militant Islamic group which was only interested in killing Shias, an Islamic group which was only interested in taking on the Pakistani security establishment or fighting in Kashmir or fighting in Afghanistan. They all have a common thread. The common thread is A, anti-Americanism, and the other common thread is try and spread this philosophy in the Islamic societies, and that is where the real challenge is going to come in the coming years.
A lot of issues we can discuss, and I want to bring our audience and our participants into this. But before I do so, let me just ask one question, following up on some of the things I've been hearing. Mr. DeLong said, well, terrorism is no longer the massive global integrated threat than it was, and there's been a lot of progress we would all accept, against Al-Qaeda Central, certainly, and many other major threats. And I wonder, over the last decade, many discussions like this would have been about the extremely active, kinetic operations of military forces or the immediate threats to which various allies were being called upon to respond. Now, if you look at the countries represented here on this panel and the continents, they're all mired in domestic turmoil, and they're facing a period in which some of the major external threats seem to be less relevant or important than the internal threats, whether it's Europe being broke and possibly breaking up, whether it's the United States trapped in political dysfunction and deadlock, whether it's Pakistan and its own morass. I wonder, is foreign policy and security issues, the kinds of things that are the bread and butter of forums such as these, no longer at the moment or for the foreseeable future, the central agenda, even for high-level major officials in the countries that all of you represent?
Well, I would say to that there is a reality of the way we can analyze it, and there is a way it is perceived by the people. If you ask the people in France, for instance, and we did, what do they think about terrorism? They think this is the number one threat, still now, by far, the number one threat. So people are very think that this threat is still there and it's still very important. Even if this threat has not materialized in France itself, indeed we had some French citizens killed, some French citizens kidnapped, some French citizens threatened abroad, but no one on French soil. But the perception by the public is that. So you are talking with something that is not linked only to foreign affairs, that is linked to the people, to their life, what they think when they travel, what they think when they go to big events, that there is a possibility that they could be hurt or killed by a bomb or something like that. So this is a major thing, and politicians have to take that into account. So that's why I said before that even if we think that Al-Qaeda is weakened, we are not in a position where we can take the risk to lower our defenses regarding terrorism. We have to keep the same level of vigilance. We have to keep the same level of intelligence. It is key. And this is one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda is in such a position now.
We know the leaders, in many cases, of terrorist groups are actually quite well educated, and surprisingly so. Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda now, a doctor, an MD, his mission is to preserve life, not take life. But we also know the foot soldiers, Gideon, are often looking for meaning in life, looking for an opportunity. And if you looked at a conference like this just 10 years ago, and I looked to Senator McCain and others who are here who've so long put their shoulder to the wheel, I think much of the conversation would be about doctrine and strategy and tactics and hardware and linking mill-to-mill operations. Now we have to create networks of civilized efforts to counter networks that are trying to create chaos to deliver political messages. I think in the long run that's healthy. I referenced the Hart-Rudman Commission initially. They were basically saying by investing in your people, by assuring that you have an energy regime that works, that's interconnected but gives you a certain amount of self-reliance, by ensuring that the civilized principles to which we all adhere have a chance to flower and bloom, that's how you defeat the forces of terrorism. And you hear that in the relationship Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton have had, and I think Secretary Panetta will continue, where Secretary Gates is one of the biggest advocates to promote investments on the civilian and the domestic and the capacity building side. So we're up to this challenge, but we have to be as wise and networked and integrated as we've ever been as a species, and that's a challenge sometimes for all of us.
That's an interesting question. The first thing that came to mind when I was listening to your question was thinking about the Republican candidate debates in the U.S. and when Ron Paul talks about pretty radical defense cuts, much more so than any other candidate, he gets a lot of applause. I think there is a sense across the country that traditional foreign policy issues, obviously war, big negotiations like climate change, people are actively saying we need to focus at home rather than abroad. So from that point of view, I think you're right. There's a much more focus at home. On the other hand, the issues we focus at home on are all framed in a global context. When we talk about rebuilding our economy and our infrastructure and our healthcare system, we are now constantly comparing ourselves to Canada when it comes to healthcare, but also, of course, to China. And when we talk about the global economy, we're constantly talking about, well, if what happens to the euro, that's going to directly affect us. So in many ways, what have been bread and butter domestic issues are now in an absolutely unavoidable global context and are actually presented that way.
Yes, it is becoming local, and issues are being tackled that way, whether it's Iraq or Pakistan or Afghanistan, or for that matter, even the United States, making your own country secure in whatever way it is possible. What is lost in this kind of decision-making is to try and understand the people or the societies from where the threat is coming from, why those societies are generating so many terrorists, why people are queuing up to become suicide bombers, why people are queuing up to join these militant forces. And I'm afraid, despite having these kind of discussions, that kind of emphasis has not been given to these societies, whether they are in Pakistani tribal regions, whether they are in Iraq or elsewhere, why those societies are constantly generating people to join these groups. And unless that kind of a discussion and debate takes place, you can go on securing your own areas, the larger threat will still remain.
Everybody here is here because they have something to say. So at this point, I'd like to broaden the conversation to include all of you. And it doesn't just have to be questions. It can be statements as long as they're concise and to the point. So let's get your takes. Who wants to come here? Please identify yourselves and offer some thoughts on what has changed and whatnot. Yes, over here. Hold on a second, actually. We're just going to bring a mic around, so it'll be good.
Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I want to take up a couple of the themes the speakers have introduced. Senator Udo's point about networking, and Abbas's theme about not knowing what's going on the ground. I look around this room, and we are a very North Atlantic grouping of people from a very, very distinct socioeconomic and intellectual sort of caste, as it were. It's almost as if we're trying to discuss the problems that affect us in an existential enclave. I'm wondering if we're talking about China and its future place in the world. There are no official Chinese representatives here. We discuss Iran as an existential threat. We're not engaging in great dialogue in a forum like this with Iranian colleagues or experts. We talk about Islamicists and the radical threat that they present. And I would venture a guess that there are very few Islamicist experts in this audience. To what extent are we talking to ourselves about our security and not really talking about global security with global interests and the interests of citizens of the globe very, very much to the forefront?
Well, I will say that there are panels later tonight, off-the-record panels, both about China and about Iran. So we're certainly going to be seized with these issues. And we do have certainly some Iranian participants here. I'm not sure if we have some official Chinese participants, but we certainly have some from Asia. So, but certainly that's the question of, one of the things that we were talking about was, the interrelation of societies, and it's no longer an us or them. I think that for all that your comment is correct, that this is still not an entirely representative gathering compared to the problems. If you think what it would have been like 10, 20, or 30 years ago, it's infinitely more diverse and more representative now than it would have been perhaps even then, I think. But Ernie, you want to chime in on that, or should we continue to, let's continue to...
I'll just make one comment. Somewhat orthogonal, but one of the things that has been most striking to me in going to many young tech conferences, or they are young because they're tech conferences, but they are far more diverse globally, in part because the blogger community is much more global and actively communicating, but also, again, it's part of what I was saying about being part of more unified communication networks. So when I go to these conferences, I am struck that there's a much, much higher international representation, and it's not just North-North.
Listen, what the gentleman from Suez was saying is you need to understand is that how many people have tried to understand why the narrative of the Islamist is gaining currency in Islamic societies, why even the people who are considered as moderate and liberal are starting to regard the United States as a bully who's trying to enforce its policy on those regions. And to understand those things, you have to engage with these people, try and understand those societies. And this is what he was trying to say, or what I understood is, you have to look from the other side why anti-Americanism is gaining ground in.
So what is the answer? Why is this
Yeah.
narrative gaining ground?
Well, it's largely because the focus is to secure yourself on for whatever reason, whatever it comes to, and that is how the policy is being approached, and this is how they look at the policy. You see, look at what the Islamic militants or terrorists are doing is, for them, killing or by bombs, whether they blow up the bombs or bombs are thrown from predators and drones, as long as Muslims are being killed, their narrative will be heard by the Muslims over there, and you have to try to understand them. You have to brand your product, why you are doing it, and that is not happening in those societies. Unless you try to do that, I think they have the time on their side, and they will continue to do what they are doing. And I'm afraid to say, they are winning the hearts and minds of the people over there.
But isn't that
Maria,
that's much more true perhaps in Pakistan? If I look across the world as a whole, or certainly across the Middle East in comparison to this time last year, I see a radical pushing back of the anti-American Islamist dialogue. What I see are movements that are focused on their own governments. Of course, there are Islamists there, but the dialogue has radically shifted to be about corruption, about governance, about self-determination, and not in many, many countries across North Africa and the Middle East. I defer to you further than
I'm
that.
not so sure that's really true. There are two societies in every country. You go and meet the officials and the debate among the English-speaking people in these countries, and it's a very different debate. You go into the masses, and the debate is very different, and that is where the focus should be.
Mr. Dulon, are we all still Americans now?
Maybe a word as a non-American, one view on this. I think there is a strong link between global terrorism and globalization. And one of the reasons of Al-Qaeda, in a way, of what Al-Qaeda represents as a global organization, has to do with globalization. This is their answer, some kind of answer, to the soft power that is mainly the fact of the Western world, and specifically the most powerful country, the United States. This is why the United States is very much at the focus of the criticism, and the all is seen as an enemy mainly by Al-Qaeda. This is not the only reason. I think this is a very important reason. You have to think in terms of globalization. For these people, and this is the way they build their own narrative, the West is trying to conquer, in a way, the whole world through the globalization, through internet, through their own values that are carried out by internet. And this is one of their ways to react to that. This is indeed the wrong way. This is indeed the wrong analysis. But I think this is one element, and this is one element why the United States is seen as a main enemy.
We're going to get a couple of more questions on the floor. Caitlin's in the back there and over here. So first, Mike over there.
Hi, everyone. Nadim Khoui from Human Rights Watch. The first question, I didn't hear any of the panelists address one of the questions that was on the agenda, which is, were these interventions worthwhile? And I think it's a good time to reflect on that. Particularly, I mean, it seems today that because of the financial crisis, because of the domestic problems, Europe and North America just want these problems to go away. They want to pull down the troops, leave Iraq and Afghanistan, and wish for the best. And I think it's time to reflect, 10 years later, was the cost in terms of human cost, financial cost, chaos, and so forth actually worth it? Particularly, I think now that the Arab Spring has shown that maybe the fundamental dynamics that were thought about the Arab world or the Muslim world were maybe erroneous, some of these assumptions. and that perhaps the biggest changes that are happening have nothing to do with the hundreds of billions of dollars and trillions that have been spent. And I think, to me, this is the most interesting bit today. You know, everyone sort of assumed that the Arab world was completely static, would not be able to change, and the only change can come from the outside. And that was probably one of the rationales as well, to try to sort of push that change by invading Iraq. That invasion probably caused fundamental problems in the region that we're still dealing with, the Sunni-Shia divisions and so forth. Didn't create it, but exacerbated. But interestingly, we're discovering new dynamics. So it'd be really interesting to hear from the panel, was it really worth it? And what have the governments, the security establishments learned from this? Particularly, I think some of those challenges remain to be seen. You look at Yemen today, the drone attacks, maybe they're becoming, in terms of intelligence, more successful, but I fear that they're actually generating more anti-American feelings in Yemen.
Okay, before the panel gets to that, we have just got a couple more comments on the floor over here. Yes. And then over here.
I'm sorry. You're next, I hope. My name is Patrick Keller. I work for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Berlin, Germany. My question goes to Dr. Slaughter. You mentioned that there are two sides of the coin to international security policy, the hard security side and then a bottom-up development policy that was very important. And you said it is necessary to bring those two communities together, more so than has been done in the past. I agree with that in principle, but I would like to hear more about how to do that exactly. Because from my experience, it has been very difficult to do that in the past. Mostly, for instance, just to name two things, because development actors or agencies value their distance from traditional hard security actors or state actors. They need it for their work and they feel uncomfortable in really joining that debate. And the second issue I think we need to address is that there are different interpretations of how to do development bottom up, how to do that exactly. And I think, going back to the very first question, that maybe the Chinese have a different idea of how to do that than we do. So how to address that and how to come up with actually a working structure or procedure of bringing these communities together. Thank you.
Okay. And one more over here. Get the next round, right?
Thank you very much. Mohammed Abu Lahum from Yemen. I don't agree that things haven't improved since 9/11. If you look at the picture in general, I mean, from 9/11 until today, I think things have really improved, and I think the war towards Al-Qaeda and radicalism has really achieved quite significantly, and I don't think we should undermine that. If you look at just a small example, Bin Laden, when he was killed, I don't think that anybody felt sorry for him, or you saw any demonstrations in the Arab world or anything. But right now, what's the most important thing that is a real challenge to the international community is how do we keep these parts of the world, especially right now with the uprising, the Arab Spring, how do you keep the Islamists engaged? How do you keep them moving towards modernization? I don't see any threat right now from the Islamists as it was 9 years ago or 10 years ago. But rather, I see the more moderate. Nobody is condemning what happened to Bin Laden, but rather everybody is happy about what happened to Bin Laden. So let's not get discouraged, but I think we have to focus more on direct communication with the Islamists, with that part of the world, and how to improve that part of the world in the side of development, and development will assure us security. So I think there is a new challenge, and this challenge has to be met by all of us. Thank you.
Raghuda, you're on these kind of things? We'll get you in now, too.
Thank you. It's Amra Ghida Dargham with Al Haya, and tomorrow I will be doing the panel, so I won't be speaking too much about it. But on the issue of Islamists, I think the narrative of the Islamists is being actually misunderstood because it's been frozen in the minds of some in the pre-Libya stage. You would see a new association between the Islamists and the NATO forces and the NATO countries. And in fact, if you look at the Arab Spring right now, there is a lot of fear of what the engagement in this embrace, the Western embrace of the Islamists, oh, let's make sure they get to power, nothing is wrong with that. Well, you know, be a woman in the Arab world and talk about that. So I think there is a bit of a rush in concluding that we need to take care only of the Islamists. I think the fear now is to leave the seculars behind, and then there's a lot of questions why the West is somehow engaging the Islamists and leaving the seculars behind, or the modernists, as I like to call them.
Okay, so Iraq, Afghanistan, the relation to the Arab Spring, how we keep things rolling forward, nice set of issues to roll up. Senator, you want to start?
What a wonderful set of questions. Let me perhaps try and respond to the gentleman up here. I think it's important to remember that the Arab Spring is not just about an organic uprising that had no involvement of the West or power. Think about the role that NATO has played in Libya. Think about the role that the mill-to-mill relationships drove in Egypt and what could have resulted and occurred on the streets of Egypt without those strong relationships with the West. I would suggest that what the Arab League has done in regards to Syria is a fundamental shift in these last weeks. And I think I don't want to be presumptuous or American-centric here, but the way in which they've stepped up perhaps have some analogies to the way NATO has acted when it's been at its best. Let me say this about Iraq and Afghanistan, and then I'll cede the stage. I think history has yet to be written. I think that what's happening in the Middle East is clearly, in the broader Asian continent, is all linked together. You can count me as one who thought we should have finished the job in Afghanistan before we entered Iraq, but we have a democracy, we have a system of government. The decision was made that Iraq presented a threat. We invaded Iraq. My request to all of you would be to wish us well, to work with us, because we all have a stake in Iraq being a successful 21st century democracy, and we all have a stake in Afghanistan being a stable country that can defend its borders and provide for its own people.
How does France look back on the last decade? With it, and I told you so, is there a Schadenfreude aspect to this? Even though it's a German word, the French can use it.
Before Francis starts, I want to thank him for what the French did in 1776 for the Americans. But that doesn't mean we still can't have disagreements in the 21st century.
Well, it is well known we have some disagreements about that. So I won't comment about Iraq because I will let that to our American colleagues and to our colleague from Pakistan as well. The position of my country is well known. I would only say that when you look back and when you look at the situation in Iraq today, just from the point of view of terrorism, you see a situation that is not stabilized. And you see a place where Al-Qaeda has been able to grow. And fortunately, there have been a lot of improvement in recent years about that. But in a way, Iraq has been a place where terrorism has been able to prosper during several years after the military intervention there. So I stop there. Regarding Afghanistan, indeed, when you look back, you think that we could have done better. We could have done more regarding Al-Qaeda itself. We could have been more focused on Afghanistan. But I think that the intervention in Afghanistan was right. Even if it's not a full success, indeed, we all know that. The intervention was right. It was right to do it. So from the point of view of my country, there is no regret about that. And I think that we have obtained success. The very fact that Al-Qaeda is no longer able, in fact, to operate from Afghanistan as no longer a safe haven there is a success by itself. But indeed, we could certainly have done better. I would like to come back maybe to another question, if I may, or if I can continue, to the balance between what should be done in terms of development, what should be done also in terms of intelligence or military action. Indeed, the question of development and bottom to the top is a very important and very tricky one. And this is something we have to take into account. This is something we try to do now, for instance, in the Sahel area, we have a situation where we see Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb progressing, in fact. They were less than 200 5 years ago, now they are almost double. And there is a possibility of links more and more with other organizations in the region, like Boko Haram, for instance, in Nigeria. This is a matter of preoccupation for us. So it is necessary to fight against Al-Qaeda and using intelligence, using all means available, indeed in close cooperation with the governments of the region. But also it is important, and we try to do that, and we do that also with the United States, we do that with Canada as well. We try to have a policy with this country in order to develop the region where Al-Qaeda is prospering. It is very complicated because you can have NGOs in these areas only if the situation is safe. So this is a very tricky policy to carry out, but we have to do it. Last point, and I stop there. The main failure from Al-Qaeda is that Al-Qaeda has not encountered any kind of support from the Muslim community and from the Arab world. And the very fact, in a way, that you had this Arab Spring is one kind of answer to Al-Qaeda. We don't need you. We can do what we have to do regarding authoritarian regimes. We do that by ourselves. We don't need you. And this is an important answer.
I'll second that last. On the development question, yes, I spent most of my 2 years in the State Department trying to move the development community and the diplomatic community closer together. It's not easy, but a large part of that comes from how we think about development. If we talk about development as a tool to fight terrorism, you are certainly not going to get the development community in the room. If you talk about development as, in the first place, an expertise, just as security is an expertise, and you recognize this is not just about short-term efforts to blunt a particular movement. This is, in fact, the longer-term answer to a whole set of problems that completely independently of terrorism we have to address. And that means then taking different countries on their own terms, different development problems on their own terms, and I think absolutely having conversations about different development models. The most interesting development models, I think, do mix public and private incentives. I just was at a conference where I heard a very prominent African woman say, you know, when the West sees a group of African school children with no shoes, they think, how can we donate the shoes? When the Chinese see the same picture, they think, by the cut of the clothing, I think they can pay this price for the shoes. And the response was, one view, the Chinese view, takes people as equals, as customers, not as essentially charity cases, and that's a far more positive message to be sending. So we need to be having those conversations. My point was just, if we're going to be talking about international security in the 21st century, that conversation is just as important as how we're going to fight Al-Qaeda. And just one word on the Islamists and the secularists. I think we have to stop talking about an Islamist narrative. It's very different country by country. In Tunisia, you have an Islamist party that has 40% of the vote. It is extremely important there, it seems to me, to be focusing on whether or not that party is going to live up to its promises with respect to women, with respect to human rights more broadly. It's a different conversation in Egypt. It's going to be a different conversation in Libya. In Syria, that we're not hearing much about that at all. In Yemen, of course, you do have Al-Qaeda in the peninsula, but we shouldn't. I think we ought to be taking it in terms of different parties, different countries, and focusing on how well you can have an Islamist party within the setting of a liberal constitution or constitution more generally.
Thoughts on any of these questions?
Let it pass.
Okay, let's keep going. So yes, here and then back there. We'll get you a mic in a second, right here.
My name is John Western from Holyoke College. I'm curious about the what's changed since 9/11 with respect to the broader world. The focus of the conversation thus far has been really on Afghanistan and Iraq and terrorism, but a whole nother pattern has happened in the last 15 to 20 years, which is a global decline in violence in terms of interstate war in terms of intrastate war. And that's happened amidst all of these other developments since 9/11. And I guess my question is, what do you think is explaining that process? We now have more effective UN peacekeeping. We know, for example, from peace researchers in Norway and Sweden, that and other scholarship on peacekeeping, that when peacekeepers are deployed to conflict zones, that the likelihood of resumption of violence is dramatically down. But I'm wondering what your perspective is on what might be explaining whether or not the world is actually getting safer, as some authors recently have suggested.
Before we come back to you, let's get some more from the floor. Back over here in the back there.
Yeah. People don't like to talk about it, oddly enough, but yeah. Quite dramatically down.
Thank you. I'm Steve Clemons with the Atlantic Monthly and the New America Foundation. I was taken with Anne Marie's comments, and I've been tweeting Anne Marie's comments. So I tweeted a note to her because I wasn't sure Gideon would come this way. It seemed to me that after World War II, there were greater efficiencies in the development issues with states that we wanted to help. People like John Foster Dulles and George Marshall created strategic economic arrangements that adopted countries like Japan and Germany, and they structured, these were not how price got right, getting the price right development models. They were, we created preferential trade deals and economic deals for very solid strategic reasons. We don't seem to do that anymore because of domestic constituencies, and so we choose an actually much more inefficient way of trying to go over and develop and embed, when if you provided highly preferential agricultural or textile quotas, you would have much more systemic effects in another country and change overnight things are going on. So I find it interesting when some of you raised the development question as something different since 9/11 and put it next to the disruption of new media. Because what new media does is it's turned everybody in not only to a global conversation with each other, but what does everybody else have? Yeah. And so the expectation of what people want and expect is very high. But the way in which we produce development in the world is so abysmally slow and I think corrupt and extremely inefficient compared to our own past. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So we're raising expectations, but what I see us doing is delivering a lot more instability because of our inability to meet them. And as Leon just laid out, in an era of austerity, the notion that we're asking lots of other ministers and whatnot here to do more with less, but haven't really told the rest of the world how we're going to do more with less. We're just asserting that somehow we'll do it. I think these are interesting gaps that need to be addressed.
Got a couple more in right over here. You had a question? Comment?
Thanks very much. My name is Paul Cornish from the University of Bath in the UK. It seems to me that part of the shock, in a way, behind this discussion is that it has been 10 years. 10 years since 9/11. Significantly longer, of course, than even World War II. And my question really concerns technology, and it's whether technological solutions to conflict and security are still considered as worthwhile or as valid, perhaps, as they might have been in the past. In military circles, it's quite usual now, as we've all heard, I'm sure, to speak of asymmetric conflict, asymmetric warfare, which you might describe as the war of the technologically weak, but very confident and courageous and very clever, against the technologically strong, but rather complacent, perhaps. And I wonder whether we still suffer in a way, from the Western conceit that technology can solve, if not all, then a substantial number of our problems. And I wonder whether we're ready, whether we really are ready for seriously long-term engagement, a different sort of conflict over a different sort of period. Are we really ready, for example, to be substantially involved in Afghanistan after 2014 for perhaps the next 25 years? Thank you.
That's a scary thought. I have to say, while listening to your comment, I'm looking at this magnificent piece of technology right over there, which is putting it in interesting perspective. Yes, one more in the back here, and then we'll bring it back to our panel.
I hope you're keeping a list.
What?
I said, I hope you're keeping the list.
My name is Mohammed Abdullah. I'm the spokesperson of the local coordination committees of Syria. I think what the U.S. realized after 5 years or 4 years of 9/11, that it was accompanied by the hate feelings or the hate speech, why they hate us, that because of the double standards in their foreign policy, and that what Secretary of State then Condoleezza Rice admit in her famous speech in American University of Cairo when she said we focused for decades on security, safety, and stability, and we ignored the rights of those people to achieve their demands and to follow their demands. And what I think why we did not really witness the anti-US sentiments during the revolution in Egypt or elsewhere, because people in the area felt for the last time that the US is standing with the people, not with the government, when they sacrificed President Mubarak and when they sacrificed President Ben Ali after President Sarkozy offered him to send police officers to beat up protesters, and then, but maintaining the double standards again when the U.S. saw Saudi Arabia sending their tanks to smash the protesters in Bahrain versus watching what's happening in Syria and pushing for UN Security Council resolution, and then again for the Palestinian state when the Palestinians denouncing the violence and they running to the UN way, the peaceful way to achieve their country and to get their own state after all President Obama's speeches about two-state solution, all these double standards that's jeopardizing all the credits that U.S. government gained during the revolutions, as people in Benghazi cheering for Americans, in Cairo, in Tunisia, even in Syria. For decades, I was in Syria, and I want to comment in the Islamists for one final line. When the Danish cartoon show up, I was there in Syria, and when people protested and set on fire all those embassies, the Danish embassy and others, versus now people has eager to be a Western model. They're asking for intervention. They called one of their Friday the no-fly zone, the NATO Friday, with no responses.
Some thoughts on any of these issues? Got a whole range of stuff to comment on if you want.
I have to make a point, on what was just said regarding the fact that Mr. Sarkozy proposed to send policemen to Tunisia. It is simply not true. I just want to correct the facts. You cannot say things like that because it is completely untrue. Okay, that's all.
Well, I'll take on the first question about the decline of conflict and why. I think there are many different factors, and some probably are connected to much greater capacity for NGOs and civil society to be engaged on the ground. Another, I think, is there has been a lot of preventive diplomacy that, of course, we don't see and don't champion if it succeeds because what it was trying to prevent didn't happen. But to me, the fact that there was not outright full-scale conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, or the fact that South Sudan was even created, is a miracle. 2 years ago, if you had told me that could happen, I'd have said not possible. That was a lot of active preventive diplomacy by many of the nations represented here. Steve, your point is very well taken. I just went to a presentation talking about when Japan joined the GATT in the 1950s, the United States did not demand reciprocal concessions and indeed paid other U.S. allies to allow Japan in. I mean, we were actively making room, and we can't do that anymore. We barely passed the Colombia and Panama trade agreements. We are doing something now in the Pacific, but very slow. I think our best hope is to strengthen regional groupings that can then bring in other nations, EU style, and we're hoping to see that also in the Pacific and maybe longer term in the Middle East. But we have deprived ourselves of a number of different weapons. And the last thing I would just say on this very important point about double standards and having to deal with both governments and the people, that is to me one of the hardest problems we're going to face. We are now engaging with diplomacy vis-a-vis governments, but also diplomacy vis-a-vis society. The biggest arguments for intervening in Libya were about exactly the impact that not intervening would have on a whole nother generation of young people across the Middle East. But once you start engaging individuals on the ground, they're going to ask you, why here and not there? They are not playing the diplomatic game of seasoned diplomats who understand inconsistencies. They tend to take you at your word and then ask you why you're not living up to it.
Let me follow up that, actually. Here we have at least 3 representatives of governments, either serving or past government officials, who have been in and around and involved in decisions to use force. There have been, over the last decade, a number of cases in which the countries represented here have gone to war in a very sort of tentative way, have avoided going to war, have put themselves on the side of a regime but not actually gone. What is it that actually drives decisions? Why do we jump in with both feet in some cases, a toe in the water in others, and not at all in some others? And I think that the question about double standards, it's not just a double standard, there's a real confusion about what it is that drives American policy, French policy, Western policy more generally, that could be cleared up. So from your all experience, is it national interest alone? Is it principle alone? Is it alliance commitments? We're curious. Inquiring minds want to know.
It is everything of that. And one cannot give a definitive answer for every kind of situation. Each situation has to be considered by itself, and each situation will lead to specific decisions. Everyone has in mind what has been done, for instance, in Libya. We were facing a situation in Libya where people in Benghazi were about to be crushed by the troops of Mr. Gaddafi, and several countries, including mine, thought that it was necessary to act. And there was a strong support in the public opinion in France for that. So this is why we have decided to act, among others, in Libya. But you can look at other situations where you cannot do that simply because it is not possible, because you don't have support internally, domestically. So in this kind of matters, you have to take into account the situation in the country, you have to take into account global policy, but you have also to take into account your internal and domestic policies, because you are accountable in front of your people. So it is not possible to give a definitive answer. I would like to do, but I cannot.
Your question's an easy one, thank you. The gentleman who pointed out that the world is a safer, more peaceful place really caught my attention, and perhaps it'd be interesting for people smarter than me to combine a study of Gideon of where force is being used and in what ways, and why the world seems to be a more peaceful place. I don't necessarily walk around feeling that way, given my assignments on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees in the Senate of the United States. But I would say to the gentleman from Syria that democracies, like people, make mistakes. Democracies, like people, are hypocritical. In fact, there's a famous axiom that you can no more banish hypocrisy from democracies than you can censorship from a dictatorship. And if I had to choose, I would choose the hypocrisies that come with being in a democratic system. Our capacities to fix our mistakes, though, are what I think signal the reason that we want to have democracies far and wide in the world. And as you know, democracies don't go to war easily. We do tend to put our foot in the water slowly. And that means at times we miss opportunities, we're not as well organized, we debate strategy, doctrine, why, on and on and on and on. But I think that's, finally, I would say, what I was going to say finally is democracies have values and we have interests. And Francis talked about Libya. If you think about why America intervened in this coalition, we were worried about oil prices. That's self-interest. We were worried about the slaughter in Benghazi. That has a moral component that fits who we identify ourselves as Americans and civilized human beings. And we were also concerned about refugee flows into the two countries on either side of Libya, Tunisia and Egypt, that might have disrupted those very fragile situations that were in those two countries. There's a combination of self-interest and moral concerns there. I'm not sure I've answered your easy question, but
it's a good setup for Anne-Marie. So if all those things were why you got involved in Libya, why not Syria?
Well, let's see what happens in Syria. But I actually do think it's easier framed. We want to stand with our values. We want to stand with the individuals who are facing governments who are shooting them. That's what we've talked about. Not only Secretary Rice, but President Obama have both gone to Cairo and made that point. The question is whether the costs of using force are going to outweigh the benefits. And in Libya, as you did a cost-benefit analysis, it looked like the benefits benefits were going to outweigh the costs. If you look at Bahrain, we absolutely condemned what the government was doing. We've worked hard behind the scenes, but the costs of using force with Saudi Arabia right there could be absolutely enormous and would probably outweigh the benefits even to the Bahrainis we might be trying to help. In Syria, that's a shifting calculus, and you're watching it shift right now. 3 months ago, if anybody had told me you would be talking about military intervention in the Arab League, I'd have said absolutely not. But when you start looking at huge refugee flows in Jordan and Turkey, you look at the destabilization of the entire region that could result from Syrian civil war, and then you start looking at the benefits of trying to act in various ways to force the government to change, it starts looking different.
Jafar, you're the editor of a major paper. Do you understand why Washington and Brussels make the decisions they do on the use of force?
Well, I don't know, but these guys know better. But I can say that how it is looked from the other side is people do think that an element of hypocrisy is there, element of double standards are there. And he was absolutely right. In democracies and big decision makings, you have to set your own priorities. All those things are there. But sitting on the other side of the world, I can see people did notice that, yes, when Gulf forces were marching into Bahrain to crush the uprising over there, yes, there were some statements of condemnation, but beyond that, not much happened because of the fear that those who were protesting on the streets were Shias and were pro-Iranians. So those feelings remain there in the world. Even in Afghanistan, when it was absolutely necessary to take action over there because it was a sanctuary, it was a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, and that space was being used to carry out attacks. But after that, the spin that you tried to give, that yes, how women's rights have been restored, how schools have been restored, how the society has been, so how democracy has been established over there. You go to Afghanistan, you go to Kabul, you can talk over here in statistics and figures and surveys about how Afghanistan is improving, and you'll see an element of artificiality over there. And even in Kabul, I'm not even talking about Kandahar. I have been going to Afghanistan since the days of the Soviets over there, and I've been covering Afghanistan for the last 30 years now. But I tell you that I'll go back to the whole thing. You need to understand, I completely agree with Dr. Slaughter that there is no Islamist movement over there. There are several, and you need to understand in these forums what these forces are, and unless you try and understand. For instance, look at the Afghan Taliban and how they are different from the Pakistani Taliban. Pakistani Taliban are the closest you can find to Al-Qaeda. They are internationalists. They believe in pan-Islamic movement. Well, look at the Afghan Taliban and try to understand. Afghans by nature are not internationalists. They only fight for their own territory, whether it was against the British or against the Soviet or against the Americans, and they will continue to fight. So there is a need to understand these things, and people feel, there are double standards on. The other thing is Americans still do not understand these societies, and when at the time of carrying out actions over there.
Okay, let's get a last batch of questions in. Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Brian Katoulis with the Center for American Progress. And actually, building on the last comment there, one question that has troubled me quite a lot is why is the situation in both Afghanistan and Iraq places where we all have placed considerable resources? If you look at it in terms of democratic rights and freedoms, and I consider Freedom House and its surveys to be the gold standard for looking at objectively the full range of political rights and civil liberties. And you look at these two societies where all of our countries have spent a lot of blood and treasure, and in 2010, 2011, Freedom House still rates these societies not free. Yes, they have electoral processes, but we've invested a lot of money in these places. And my own concern with Iraq and the debate that we have on Iraq is we're turning a blind eye to the recent authoritarian tendencies in this current Iraqi government. So it's really, I'm puzzled by this question myself as an analyst. Why, after the expense of so much resources and so much talent over there, that we can't actually produce even a partly free society using Freedom House's rankings? 8 or 10 years? And I know these things take time, but I'd love to hear the panel's sort of introspection on that question.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Jim Hogue from Human Rights Watch. Russia and China both are objecting, even to this day, about the Libyan intervention, saying that NATO real reason was a regime change, not the protection of civilians. My question is, because there's been a lot of talk here and elsewhere about multilateralizing, about getting more cooperation on security around the globe. Is that really possible on difficult issues like the one I just mentioned, or Syria coming up, between nations that have such profoundly different values at the heart of their operations and their thinking?
Two more, right there. Right here, him. Did you want it? Oh, it was, yes.
You were smart enough to bring a pen.
Thank you. The difference between Syria and Libya is similar to the difference between oil and olive oil.
Oil and olive oil.
Let me mention to you a few points related to the discussion. First, Arab countries are divided into three categories. Some countries who receive aid, food aid, from United States from the West, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Palestine, Lebanon, and so on. Other category of countries who receive security protection, mainly the Gulf countries. Third category of countries who receive nothing, Sudan, Syria, Algeria, and so on. What did the countries who receive Western assistance, what did they give in return? Hate to the West, they exported terrorism, and the most important thing is that they themselves, they have corrupt regimes. The Mubarak regime is the third serving ruler since Tuhutmos II, Muhammad Ali, and Hosni Mubarak. 42 years. Bin Ali, and so on and so forth. So the corruption that these countries enjoy, quote unquote, they themselves, perceived by their people, are protected and given legitimacy by the West. So therefore, the trade between what you give and what you get back is something that we have to look at in terms of having economic development, poverty alleviation, democracy, political participation, and so on. Now that the Arab Spring is there, and I think the outcome of the September 11 has nothing to do with having the world much safer. It has to do with the Arab uprising changing the reality on the ground in a way that it will reflect itself positively. But don't rest assured, because the problems in the region are not settled yet. Without having the question of Palestine, which is the center of the conflict in the Middle East, I think it will be very difficult to really have a comfortable situation. My last point, Senator McCain was speaking in the first day of this conference 2 years ago, and I asked Senator Udall, I was sitting beside him, how much do you spend in Afghanistan with NATO forces? Sir, you told me it's around $70 billion. If part of that money is invested for economic development in these poor countries who are really exporting terrorism because of whatever reason is, unemployment, poverty, and so on, maybe the story will be different in the Middle East. Thank you.
We have lots of more people who would love to speak. We have several days of the conference. There'll be lots of other opportunities. So let me just turn it briefly over to our panelists for any final thoughts they might have before we wrap this up on any of the questions raised.
Well, maybe just 2 sentences. It is right. I don't think we are living in a safer world after 9/11. I agree with you, Senator. The world is still dangerous. We are still facing the risk of terrorism in various parts of the world. But I think the ideology of Al-Qaeda is no longer supported, and it is no longer able to be carried out by an organization like Al-Qaeda. And this is nevertheless a progress.
Anybody else have any final thoughts?
In that spirit, those were, again, very insightful and important comments. And the gentleman that talked about oil to olive oil, I would love to read further what you've written and the analysis you've provided and the conclusions you've drawn, and I'm glad you're here. I would just like to conclude on this note. I think we need to remember that terror is a tactic. Terror is not an enemy. And we've had a robust debate in the United States about whether war on terror is an appropriate term. Does it give us the right construct to face this challenge? And my answer would be to return to what I said initially, which is that if we think about building our own societies tied to a combination of different kinds of power, and that we deal with a world that needs increasing amounts of energy, and energy that isn't carbon emitting, that we're on our way to a broader solution in a more peaceful world. And I look forward to the rest of the conference spending some time on those important and vexing questions. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, Zafar, any final thoughts?
So just quickly to Brian's question about why these countries are worse off, I think one of the big lessons of the last decade is we go back to Hobbes. Without security, without a central monopoly on security, nothing else can flourish. And we have not been able to establish that. That's an important lesson going forward. To Jim Hogue, I do think we're actually more multilateral and more multilaterally effective. I think if you look at the record in the Security Council over the past 3 years, and really even going back probably over the last 5, you will see more votes on Iran, on North Korea, on Ivory Coast, on Libya, and a lot of smaller issues that we pay less attention to. I also think the combination of a regional organization that pulls itself together and then the Security Council is very important. I think Russia and China are going to have a very hard time not imposing something if the Arab League is asking them to do it. And that's part of what we're about to see. But I see ourselves broadening the power at the table. We've gone from the G8 to the G20. We've changed the voting rights in the IMF. We're starting to talk about different members of the Security Council. It's hard, but I think it's working fairly well. The last thing I will just say is we're not going to be more secure unless the we encompasses everyone. So maybe we in the West feel less secure, but I think the point was millions and millions and millions of people, billions of people, are actually more secure because there is less conflict in their lives, even if there may be more in ours. And I think the point was to actually understand the world from that perspective is going to be the key to our own security going forward.
Like any good party, we'll end at dawn. Zafar?
I'll just try and answer the question from the gentleman from the Freedom House. You cannot enforce or impose democracies from outside. You try and do that, chances are that they will collapse. It's an evolving process from within. You can support democratic forces in a country, but you try and enforce democracy and say, look, go and see what a bright democracy and democratic society it is. It's not going to work. As compared to look at Pakistan, in the last 50, 60 years, United States has largely supported military rulers over there, whether it was General Zia-ul-Haq or General Musharraf and others, rather than supporting, for the first time, it is supporting a democratic process. And not because for the love of Pakistani Democrats, but largely because it is at odds with the Pakistani military. Pakistani military has a double game to play, having some militants to support in Afghanistan. And that is why it wants to strengthen democracy over there. But in Pakistan, democracy has evolved. I don't know how many people know in Pakistan, among the developing countries, it has got the most fearlessly independent media. It has got a system where you can stand up and criticize the president and live another day. And this is what is happening over there. I wish you continue to support democracy in countries like Pakistan, which has evolved from the within. You try to impose something called democracy, chances are it's going to collapse.
I'd like to thank all our panelists, thank all our audience. We've laid down a powerful opening barrage, and I look forward to having the next few days as we charge through the gaps.